everyone. Thank you for coming today. Today, I want to tell you a story. And in this story is a software developer. We'll call him Jake. Jake is working on an ambitious new web application. And he and his team are super excited about the goals of the project. But as often happens, the project's a bit behind schedule. And he and his team just spent a long week wrapping up a key feature that they needed to deliver for some investors. So it's a Monday now, and Jake also had to deal with some family issues over the weekend. He's feeling really worn out. But he doesn't have any PTO and knows that the rest of his team is working hard as well. So he decides to tough it out and head into the office. One of the first things he does, as many developers do, is check on that pull request he opened on Friday. He sees he got a review, and he decides to check the comments. But there was only one comment left, and it was by a senior engineer on the team. This won't work. Nothing else. So Jake's left here thinking to himself, well, why not? I worked hard on this, and it is what was asked. I met the criteria. But he doesn't spend a whole lot of time on it. He has a meeting coming up. It's his first one-on-one of the day with his manager. And his manager has been really busy, so he gets there a bit early, hoping to have some time to just talk about his frustrations and the issues that he's been seeing with the project. But as soon as his manager gets through the door, he asks, so did you finish feature X? Now, feature X was supposed to be delivered last week, but due to some complications with other teams, it never got finished. They spend their whole time discussing that. So Jake's, again, left here thinking, no, I didn't finish it, but that's not what I wanted to talk about. So now it's lunchtime, and Jake heads to lunch with his teammates. He's hoping that since it's Monday, maybe they can talk about something other than work and tech for a little bit. But because the meeting ran a little over, he gets to lunch a bit late, and his teammates are already deep in conversation about the latest JavaScript framework. Have you heard about New Thing JS? Jake hasn't heard of this. He was busy dealing with family stuff all weekend. So he's thinking, great, yet another thing that I need to go learn. This feeds into his already negative emotions about the day. Right? There's so much going on. He feels like there's too much going on. So after lunch, he just heads back to his desk, fires up his text editor, and quietly works away. He's hoping to avoid any more frustration this day. He can't quite get into flow with his work, and so he checks his email and checks Twitter a bunch until finally it hits 5, and he feels it's acceptable to clock out. All of this leaves Jake feeling really down about his job. Now, how many of you have had a day like Jake did, where you feel worn out, defeated, like you didn't really have a support system in place? I see a lot of hands going up. Well, this story is really similar to parts of my own story, and I'm sure it's part of many stories that could be shared in this audience. So my name is Trent Willis. I'm currently a senior UI engineer at Netflix, and today I want to talk about a skill which I believe is very important, but often undervalued in our industry. That is the ability to care for your fellow developers. You see, the tragic aspect of this story is that this one disappointing and discouraging day can turn into weeks or months of feeling worn out at work, which means you have lost productivity, lower team morale, and potentially the loss of a talented employee. So how could this day have gone differently? How could Jake's coworkers have been more supportive without knowing what was going on in Jake's personal life or understanding the thoughts that were going through his head? That's what we're going to explore for the remainder of this talk. So first, let's look a bit closer at that first word, caring. In this context, it's an action. It's not a state of being, but something which you perform. In talking with developers and managers, I've found that caring or empathy is often discussed with a lot of ambiguous or amorphous concepts like being a caring person or being emotionally intelligent. But rarely do we ever talk about the specific actions which we think exemplify what it means to be caring or how we can get better at it. The good news here, though, is that caring, since it is an action, means that we can practice it. And if we can practice it, that means that we can get better at it. And if we can get better at it, then that means that we can share insights with each other on how we think that we can be more caring. So now's a good time for me to mention that I'm not a caring person by nature. I'm an introvert in the sense that I get worn out when I interact with others. And so being supportive, especially for difficult issues is really, really draining for me. Additionally, I tend to keep to myself and can have a hard time relating to others. I'm sure at least some of you in the audience know what this is like. But I've had wonderful folks in my life call me out on how I interact with others and encourage me to be better. So now I look at it this way. I respect my limitations, but I don't use them as an excuse. I know that I'm going to have to put forth extra effort in order to be more supportive and care for my teammates, and that it will cost me some energy. But that's no reason for me not to do it. You see, we're all humans first and developers second. And I definitely put in lots of effort towards being a better developer, so it's only reasonable that I can put in at least a little bit of effort towards being a better and more caring person. So, with that in mind, let's look at some concrete examples of how we can get better at caring. First up, reviews. Whether it's a code review, a design review, or a product review, the act of reviewing decisions and soliciting feedback about those decisions is a relatively routine part of most developers' work. So it's unfortunate that these often cause a lot of stress or can be anxiety-producing or just feel frictionful. So how can we be more caring? How can, by caring, we reduce the stress that we feel when having to have our decisions reviewed? Well, to start, there are a lot of things we can do, and Vaidehi Joshi has written an awesome article called Crafting Better Code Reviews that covers a ton in this area. It covers everything from technical ways that you can improve them to soft skills that you might want to be employing. But when it comes to caring, there's really only one specific aspect that I want to look at, and that is the emotional and interpersonal aspect of reviews. These are nuanced areas that we all know exist, and we know that they come into play, but we often don't think about them or don't talk about them. In our article, Vaidehi groups these under the header, the harder things, but the most important. And so why do we consider these the harder things? Why are they considered the most important things? Well, it's because they're almost entirely about people. Or more specifically, they're about people and communication between those people. Whether it's communicating ideas or communicating feedback, critiques, whatever, the communication between a reviewer and a reviewee is really the avenue by which reviews derive their value. If someone just leaves a thumbs up or an approval or a thumbs down on your review, then it doesn't really tell you much. You're not getting much value out of it. Now, I don't plan to try to solve the immensely difficult topic of interpersonal communication in this talk, but bringing it into focus helps us be better at realizing that we're probably not as good at reviewing as we like to think we are. And understanding that is really the first step towards showing that we care. Because by doing that, we acknowledge that we have some room to improve and that we can improve. So, what can we do to actually show that we care? Well, the first step is to acknowledge that we're commenting on another person's work. This is super critical, as it's really easy for us to think that the work someone produces and the person themselves are completely divorced from each other. But this just isn't true. During a review, the code that you're reviewing was produced by someone, and at the very least, it represents their ideas and how they thought to approach a problem. And so there's some level of emotional attachment there. So when someone comments negatively or has a differing opinion, it's only natural that we should feel some negative emotions about that. So one of the first questions that I always ask myself is, would I say this to that person's face? If you were to be having a conversation rather than leaving a virtual comment, is this the same thing that I would be saying? Bringing that personal dimension into your reviews and into your communication is really the first step towards showing you care, because you are treating them as a person. And this is much easier to do when we realize that it's someone's work. It's not work that just spontaneously appeared out of nowhere. The next step, beyond bringing that personal dimension in, is to not be tone deaf. And by that, I mean be cognizant of the tone that you use during your reviews or any communication. Many, if not all of us, have interacted at one time or another with someone that came across as negative or condescending or aloof, and that can be really draining. And so just as it's draining in actual conversation, it's also draining when we have to read those comments or read those emails. So we need to be conscious that we don't let the detachment of sitting behind a computer translate into the way that we communicate via that same computer, or phone, or what have you. So to illustrate why this is really important, I want to share a brief story. So I was once working on a project that was supported by a very skilled and very experienced infrastructure team. This infrastructure team was often deferred to when we had to make difficult technical decisions because they had lots of experience and expertise in the tech stack. Unfortunately, some members of this team often came across as a bit aloof or condescending when communicating with developers that were working on the project itself. And because of that, the developers on the project began to actively avoid seeking out the advice of these other developers. Due to this, the project ran into several technical issues that probably could have been avoided had they gained the insight of these more experienced and expertised developers. So the tone and communication style of some people on this infra team, it wasn't even the whole team, just a couple people, but their tone and the way they communicated directly affected this project. Not only did it lead to technical problems, but it also resulted in lower team morale and some negative opinions about the relationships that developers had with this infrastructure team. So what can you do to make sure that this doesn't happen? Well, to start, if you've never really thought about your communication style or the tone that you use when you're communicating, try talking to your coworkers. Ask them, hey, what do you think about the way that I communicate? I can almost guarantee that they'll have some feedback for you. This can be targeted either specifically at reviews in the review process, or it could be more general. Beyond that, or to go one step further, ask them what you can do to improve. Like, knowing how they perceive you is one step, but then understanding what they think you can do better will definitely go a long way towards building a better communication style between you and the rest of your team. So beyond soliciting this feedback, though, I also have 3 guidelines that I keep in place to help me understand how I'm communicating. Those are ask questions often, explain frequently, and never decree. By asking questions, we acknowledge the rationality and the intelligence of the other person that we're talking with. By explaining, we leave less room for misinterpretation, and we share opportunities for others to learn and to gain more context into the project. And then by not decreeing, we avoid coming across as aloof or out of touch with the experiences of the other developers. So applying those guidelines, how might the review comment that Jake received earlier in the day have looked? Well, instead of saying this won't work, the developer might have chosen to say, can you explain why you approached it this way? I'm not sure this will work because, and then insert his rationale. This approach does several things. First, it acknowledges that Jake's a rational person. He had to have reasons for why he approached the problem the way he did. Second, it provides context from the reviewer's viewpoint as to why this won't work, which Jake may have been missing that context. Or at the very least, it allows Jake to see where the reviewer is missing context that he has. And then finally, it shows that time and care were put into this review. It wasn't just a drive-by to crap all over Jake's important work. And so the only real drawback here is that it took the reviewer more time to construct his comment. But really, that's the least that we should be expecting from our reviewers. So I could say tons more about reviews and review processes, but I want to end this section by saying this. Make opportunities for praise. That is to say, there's a place for praise in the review process, even when you have to provide critiques or potentially disagree with the other person. If nothing else, simply drop in a great job or a thanks for the hard work comment from time to time. Technical comments and critiques can be really draining, and so a constant barrage of them doesn't help anyone. Throwing in some positivity from time to time can really restore a lot of that lost energy. This goes doubly so if you're a senior engineer or a lead developer on a team. Your words matter, especially towards those that might be looking up towards you. So moving on, Jake had a less than stellar experience in his one-on-one meeting. Now, this meeting was with his manager, but it could have been with anyone. Could have been a coworker, someone he viewed as a mentor. But the fact that it was his manager carried extra weight. However, we also need to remember that Jake's manager probably wasn't acting malicious. He likely has a lot on his plate going on as well. So how could his manager have been more caring? How could he have shown support for Jake and the issues that he was going through, while also understanding his concerns? Well, to start, he needs to tailor the experience, which is to say, you need to know who you're meeting with beyond just their name and job title. Before meeting with them, take stock of their unique qualities. If they like to chat about their social life, make sure you allow for ample time for that. If, however, they like to keep it short and to the point, make sure you try to do that as well so they don't feel like you're wasting their time. Beyond that, make sure that you're planning for the meeting, the content and substance. Make sure you have some clear objectives and accomplishments that you hope to get out of this meeting. Now, some of those might be work-oriented, but some of them should also be focused on building a stronger and deeper relationship. Chances are, if you're having a one-on-one with someone, then your relationship would benefit from being more than just tactical and business-oriented. Building a better relationship of trust will allow you to work better together, more closely, and therefore deliver better results. So, when setting these objectives, though, we need to remember that this meeting is not just for you. The person you're meeting with is also going to be coming in with things that they want to accomplish and their ideas of what they should be getting out of this meeting. By being open and available with your time, by asking them, hey, is there something you want to talk about? And being flexible to changes in your meeting structure, you're going to build a lot better rapport with the person you're meeting with. If you have an absolutely critical topic that you need to discuss, though, maybe you should move that to a meeting just for that. So all of this ties into an idea called psychological safety. So back in 2012, Google did a study about what makes some teams more effective than others. Their research over a couple years and over 100 teams found that psychological safety was a key indicator of effective teams. But what does that term mean, psychological safety? Well, in the field of psychology, it's a team trait marked by conversational turn-taking and average social sensitivity, among other things. Now, if you're like me, that probably doesn't mean a whole lot to you. So put more plainly, what it means is that if you speak up, you have confidence that your team won't embarrass you or reject you or scold you for your ideas that you share. So how does this tie into the one-on-one meeting? Well, if you're setting a culture where the person you're meeting with can speak up and steer the conversation, then you're going a long way towards creating a culture where your greater team feels that way. The reason is, if you're leading a one-on-one, then there is at least some level of influence that you have on your team. And that is very important. As someone with influence, you need to be making sure that your teammates feel safe and comfortable. So if we go back to the meeting from earlier in Jake's day, how might his manager have approached this instead? Well, instead of immediately asking about feature X, he could have asked, hey, I have something I'd like to talk about, but is there anything that you'd like to discuss first? This would give Jake the opportunity to bring up his concerns. Now, it's important, though, that Jake's manager doesn't say something to the effect of, hey, I have something very important I'd like to bring up. Because if he does that, then it might sway Jake to believe that his topic isn't really that important, that it's not that crucial. And the flip side of this coin, though, is that Jake needs to realize that his manager does have something he wants to talk about. And caring goes both ways. And so if Jake runs out of time to discuss the topics that his manager had originally intended, then he should be open and available to meeting again, and he should be the one to suggest it. Now, you might question at this point if this strategy always makes sense. What if there's some really important topic that his manager needed to discuss? What if it was blocking another team? And what if Jake's frustrations couldn't be addressed quickly? Well, you'll need to use your best judgment. I mean, as with most things in software development, there's no one-size-fits-all solution. But I would urge you to make sure that you don't turn short-term frustrations into long-term losses. And I want to illustrate this point with another short story, albeit a slightly more technical one than before. I was working on a new project, and it was on a brand new tech stack. And so because of that, we didn't have a lot of the tooling that we used to have in place. But early on, we decided to adopt some linting rules for code quality and consistency. Now, while this was great in theory, we didn't really follow through and iron out all the kinks. And so This caused some frustration, and there was murmuring amongst the developers that this was a frustration. But no one found or thought that it was important enough that they should push it and escalate it so that it actually got fixed. And so because of that, it kind of just festered in the background. And as the team grew and the code base grew, matters only got worse and worse. Debates and nitpicks in code reviews started happening, which caused frustrations to rise, which slowed down developer time, and in the end resulted in killing the team's morale, at least in this one area, and lowering opinions about how the project was being run as a whole. So when we did get around to fixing it, there was a tremendous tax that we had to pay. Had we taken a week or two out when we first started hearing about this, it would have been a short-term frustration. No one would have thought much of it. But because we let it linger, it became a really long-term loss for the project, both in time and in morale. So now you might have noticed that in the story, no one really pushed very hard for it to be fixed. But there was murmuring of it, and people knew that it was a frustration. So this reminds me of a quote by management guru Peter F. Drucker, who said, "The most important thing in communication is hearing what isn't said." Now, often this quote is used when talking about nonverbal communication, but it also applies to verbal communication. In the previous example, even though no one was complaining or saying that they needed to fix the linting issue directly, people were talking about it being a frustration. Sometimes, though, it's not that obvious. Maybe you see a coworker who's been staying late a lot recently, and every time he talks, he seems to be frustrated, but doesn't really say anything specific that's bothering him. Well, in both of those cases, you can identify ways to help and to support and to care for your teammates. In the linting scenario, maybe you go and escalate it until you find someone that can fix it. Or if you don't know the scope of the issue, you go and ask some developers, hey, will getting this fixed really help your life, your work life? In the latter scenario, go to your teammate. Ask them if you can take on some of their work to help them. Or if you don't have the bandwidth to do that, go talk to your manager or their manager and ask them about getting more resources to help. Or at least ask them about changing some expectations on when these needed to be delivered. The point is that there are bound to be opportunities to show that you care and can support your teammates if you take a moment and look for them. So one last point about meetings. If you've never done it before, I would highly recommend trying out going for a walk. Anecdotally speaking, it can be a lot more relaxed or feel a lot easier to talk about things when you don't have to stare at someone from across a table. This is especially true if you have a difficult subject that you need to bring up, right? If I'm staring at my manager from across a table, it's going to be a lot harder for me to want to bring up a hard question than it is when I'm walking and looking at trees or looking at my feet. So we've now talked about two specific work-related areas where we can try to care more in. But what about our other day-to-day activities? If you're a developer, hopefully you spend a good bit of time doing things other than code reviews and meetings. So how do we care for our fellow teammates when we're getting lunch, or when we're chatting about the latest tech, or simply during a lull in the day, if you're lucky enough to have one? Well, my first tip here is close the shop. And by that, I mean talk about something other than work for a little bit. As high-performing and motivated individuals, it's really easy for us to just talk shop all the time. I've met plenty of developers and other managers, so have you, in the tech industry who love what they do, and they love their jobs, and that's fantastic. But if that's all that I ever know about them, then I'm missing out on critical opportunities to build deeper relationships and potentially even memories with them. And those go a long way towards building stronger teams, which can be more effective in the long run. So we should inquire about friends and family, ask about their hobbies, maybe talk about local events, or discuss their favorite Netflix series. The possibilities are really almost endless. And showing that you care about a person outside of their role at work is really a critical component to developing psychological safety in your team, because it says to them, hey, I care about you beyond just what you're doing at the office. So remember Jake's lunch conversation from before? Maybe instead of diving right into the latest tech, his coworkers could have taken a moment and asked about how everyone's weekend was. This would have given Jake an opportunity to open up and share how he's feeling about the project or his family issues, And maybe his teammates would have been feeling similar and could have commiserated with him. Or if that's too personal, he could have at least sat back and gotten a glimpse into what's going on in the rest of his team's life, and maybe found something mutually in common to talk about. Now, this isn't to say that you should never talk about work, especially if it's something that interests you and your coworkers. So really, it's close the shop occasionally. Don't shut it down permanently, but every now and then try to put non-work things at the forefront. Once you do this, I think you'd be surprised at how easy it is to find other things to talk about. Now, and this also opens up doors for potential relationships outside of the office. And now, I'm not a believer that you need to hang out with your coworkers outside of the office in order to build caring and effective teams. But I do believe that having friends outside of the office that you can share things with and frustrations at work and the like really is a key part of having good health and mental health. And so if they can be one and the same, if they can be both your work friends and your outside of work friends, then that's fantastic. So at this point, it can probably feel like I've been prescribing a bunch of steps or like action items that you need to do in order to build a caring and effective team. But that's not really the point. The point here is to translate an amorphous concept of caring into specific actions or practices that we can think about, and therefore generate new ideas about how we can care for each other. Behind it all lies an idea that author Bob Goff expressed really simply in his book called Love Does. In it, he says, you don't need a plan, you just need to be present. What does it mean to be present in this context, though? It's not so much about the current moment or the current location that you're in, as it is about the current setting and background that you find yourself and your teammates in. It's about the understanding the unique intersection of the individual people you work with, yourself, and your work environment. Understanding this context, being present in this context, lets you see how your code review comments might be interpreted negatively by your teammate. It lets you understand that the person you're meeting with is looking worn out and probably needs a break. And it also lets you understand when your team is ready to celebrate a victory or just needs some celebration. And that last point is really important because it would be really easy to get the idea from this talk that caring really only matters when bad things are happening and when people are down in the dumps. But that's just not true. Sharing celebrations and victory is also really important. If you're only present in someone's life when things are rough, then that's going to develop an unhealthy relationship. You need to be there for them at other times as well. So remember how Jake just kind of sulked back to his desk after lunch? I'm sure many of you have seen coworkers in similar situations. Whether it's increased sighing, or longer stares off into the distance, or just abnormal quietness, there's usually signs when people are feeling worn out and down in the dumps at work. By being present with someone and actively giving them some attention every now and then, it doesn't have to be all the time, you can begin to notice when people seem off. In those moments, though, it's often easier for us to pretend that it doesn't exist or just ignore it. But I would encourage you to lean in just a little bit and ask, hey, are you doing okay? Is there anything you want to talk about? Or maybe make it a little bit more personal. Hey, I've noticed that you've been a bit more quiet than normal. Is everything going okay? Sometimes that's all it takes to turn someone's day or entire week around. Don't push it. Just let them know that you're there and that you care. As a brief example, one of the closest coworkers I've ever had loved Martinelli's apple juice, as do I. But they didn't stock it in the building that we worked in on campus. Now, I know that this is a Silicon Valley problem, but that's the reality. However, they did stock it in a building across our campus. And so, every now and then, we'd go for a walk to get some apple juice. On this walk, which only took a couple minutes, was a chance for us to talk openly about whatever we wanted without fear of other people being around. We could rant about anything that's frustrating us, or we could talk enthusiastically about things that are exciting us. There was no expectation there that we had to talk, though. There was just an invitation. And that difference between expectation and invitation was huge, because it meant that I had someone I could go to talk about something if I needed to. But I could also keep to myself if I wanted. And as an introverted person, that's really important. So those walks helped me find my bearings and really understand and put things in perspective for me during my time with that coworker. So this leads me to my final word of advice. Be available and be open. When I talked to a bunch of developers and managers when putting together this talk, I asked them, what would you recommend doing to be a more supportive and more empathetic teammate? And about half of them said something along the lines of, be available when your teammates need you and be open when you respond to them. The reasoning here is that being available makes you approachable by your coworkers, even the new ones on your team. If you're never around, if you're never at your desk, then it may seem to them like you're too busy or too important to care about whatever's going on in their lives. Now, if you have to be at a lot of meetings, as I know some leads and managers do, then let them know that you would prioritize requests from them to meet. Let them know that they are still a priority for you, even if you can't be physically at your desk all the time. And if you're open when you do respond in these situations, and by that I mean letting them know everything that they need to know until they don't have any more questions, then that builds trust. Most developers are astute people. They can tell when you're just giving them enough information to get them on their way or holding something back. And that can breed a lot of distrust. So go above and beyond to be helpful when you're responding to someone. It may take a little bit of extra time and effort, but it would help build a much deeper relationship. So I know for myself, this can be really difficult, especially if I'm under pressure to deliver a feature or have a lot of meetings on my calendar for whatever reason. But I have found that making time for my teammates and really being present when they're coming to me has helped build much deeper relationships, and on top of that, it has instilled confidence in them. They know that I trust them. So to this advice, though, of being available and being open, I would also add, be encouraging. As with praise in the review process, a little bit of encouragement goes a long way. If a junior developer is coming to you with questions about how to implement a feature, end your conversation by letting them know how excited you are to see how it turns out. If you're working through a hard problem with a peer, let them know that you're thankful that they're working on it with you. Or if you find yourself having to go to a senior lead on your team frequently, let them know that you appreciate their help and that you're really thankful for how much it is benefiting you. We often know that we're supposed to do good work, and many of us are expected to do good work, which is why we have jobs. But just because it's expected or required doesn't mean that it shouldn't be encouraged and celebrated when we recognize it. It doesn't take a whole lot of energy to say some kind words and some encouraging words to someone, but the amount of energy that it imparts to that person can be really tremendous. So to wrap up, I want to mention a quote by the paragon of Silicon Valley, Steve Jobs. He once said, "Great things in business are never done by one person. They're done by a team of people." And that last word, people, I believe is really critical to the sentiment expressed here. We're not software developers or UI engineers or product managers. Those titles might be part of how we think about ourselves and communicate what we do, but they're not really part of our being. Being human, on the other hand, is. We are all people. So I urge you all to put forth a little bit of extra effort every day towards being a better and more caring teammate to others. Maybe instead of getting shit done, we focus on growing people. My hope is that this talk has helped show that caring for someone and being an empathetic developer doesn't require a lot of fancy process or for you to change your personality completely. But it does require you to put yourself in the shoes of others and be present with them in your day-to-day life. And from this little bit of effort that we put into this, we can grow people much more than they ever otherwise would have. And from that labor, we can begin to go farther than we ever have before in both our work and beyond, because there is more to life than just work. Thank you.